Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Friday, 28 February 2025. Today is the 143rd anniversary of the birth of José Vasconcelos Calderón, who was born in Oaxaca on this date in 1882. Some years ago, when I was flying home after having traveled in South America, I had to make an overnight stopover in Mexico City. I got a room smack dab downtown with a balcony overlooking the central square of the city, the Plaza de la Constitucion. As it happened, there was a political rally that night, and that I don't speak any Spanish, I was amused that I was able to understand one sentence from one of the speeches, which was this: Mexico is a unique country. This is what I would call a non-Copernican perspective, but I'm sure that there would be many who would agree that Mexico is a unique country. Certainly, Mexico is numerically distinct, but is it qualitatively distinct? I think Jose Vasconcelos believed Mexico to be a qualitatively unique country. Many of us would count contemporary Latin America, generally speaking, and Mexico more specifically, as being a part of Western civilization. But Vasconcelos' conception of the Mexican people as the cosmic race and his understanding of Mexico's place in history is a good introduction to the profound internal differences possible within the larger tradition of Western civilization. It's also a reason enough to read Vasconcelos. For Vasconcelos, the implied other of his society was the Anglo-Saxon society that dominated North America, which he described as follows, quote, "The Anglo-Saxon mission has been accomplished sooner than ours because it was more immediate and was already known to history. In order to accomplish it, all that was necessary was to follow the example of other victorious people. Being mere continuators of Europe in the region of the continent they occupied, the values of the whites reached the zenith. This is why the history of North America is like the uninterrupted and vigorous allegro of a triumphal march," unquote. According to Vasconcelos, the Anglo-Saxons of North America were following an established template, and this was the template of Europe. With this model to follow, the Anglo-Saxons of North America could fulfill their destiny almost as a matter of course. The cosmic race in Mexico, by contrast, had a distinct history and a distinct destiny. Vasconcelos wrote, quote, "Our own physical isolation and the mistake of creating nations, together with the original mixture of bloods, has served to keep us from the Anglo-Saxon limitation of constituting castes of pure races. History shows that these prolonged and rigorous selections produce types of physical refinement interesting but lacking in vigor. They have a strange beauty, like that of the Brahmanic caste, but are decadent in the end. Never have they been seen to surpass other men, neither in talent, in goodness, or in strength," unquote. For Vasconcelos, the racial uniformity of North America was its strength in achieving its early zenith, but also its weakness in almost every other respect. Vasconcelos thinks that North America peaked early and has no future other than decline. The racial experience of Latin America, however, is dramatically different. The cosmic race has what we could call the non-naturalistic equivalent of hybrid vigor. Vasconcelos explains as he continues, quote, "The road we have initiated is much more daring. It breaks away from ancient prejudices, and it would be almost unexplainable if it were not grounded on a sort of clamor that reaches from a remote distance, a distance which is not that of the past, but that mysterious distance from where the presage of the future comes," unquote. Who is, or what is, the cosmic race? Magnus Murner, in his book Race Mixture in the History of Latin America, opens with a ringing quote from Vasconcelos, and I will give a slightly longer version of the quote that Murner used in order to give it a little more context. Quote, We in America shall arrive before any other part of the world at the creation of a new race fashioned out of the treasures of all the previous ones, the final race, the cosmic race, unquote. Murner says that this proclamation is abstract and cultural, but, quote, his vision of a new tropical race does reflect an existing situation. No part of the world has ever witnessed such a gigantic mixing of races as the one that has been taking place in Latin America and the Caribbean since 1492. In fact, it is impossible to determine the racial status of most Latin Americans without a genetic and anthropometric investigation. Toward the end of the 18th century, if we were to believe a very knowledgeable historian, miscegenation, or mestizaje in Spanish, was so advanced in Mexico that there were few individuals of pure race left in the country, unquote. Some sources say that mestizaje was introduced in the 20th century as a polite term for miscegenation. But Vasconcelos' vision of a mestizo Latin America was primarily concerned with Mexico, where race mixing had gone the farthest. And still today we hear references to Mexicans as La Raza, and these are abbreviated references to La Raza Cosmica. So Vasconcelos retains his currency in Mexico to the current day. To Mexico, we might also add Brazil, where race mixing is also common, but others have extended Vasconcelos' vision throughout Latin America. In Che Guevara's Motorcycle Diaries, he recounts a response that he gave to a toast at a dinner in Peru in 1952. Quote, we believe, and after this journey more firmly than ever, that the division of America into unstable and illusory nations is completely fictional. We constitute a single mestizo race, which from Mexico to the Magellan Straits bears notable ethnographical similarities. And so, in an attempt to rid myself of the weight of small-minded provincialism, I propose a toast to Peru and to a united Latin America, unquote. Here we see the same rejection of nation states that we've seen in Vasconcelos, which he called the mistake of creating nations, and the same appeal to universalism, which Guevara expresses by explicitly distancing himself from provincialism. Vasconcelos himself had a more complex relationship to universalism, as expressed in the book Leopoldsia, From Mexicanidad to a Philosophy of History by Solomon Lipp. Quote, Vasconcelos asserted that America was capable of surpassing Europe in the realm of thought. Universality was itself characteristic of Latin America. Nevertheless, the national component seemed to emerge triumphant. The continent was heir to all of the experiences which Europe and Asia had to offer, since it had always been the crossroads of the world. Even though Vasconcelos seemed opposed to universalism, he was nevertheless careful to distinguish between philosophic nationalism and a philosophy which was forged as a result of national experience. We can lay claim to a philosophy from the Hispanic point of view, he insisted, with the same right that Germans, Frenchmen, or Englishmen have their respective national schools. These are all considered points of departure in an effort to elevate humanity, unquote. The cosmic race, then, is universal because it draws on many peoples and many cultures, though these many peoples and many cultures become, in their turn, a people with a distinctly Hispanic point of view. I'm going to quote a passage from the cosmic race that I find particularly interesting, and after I quote it, then I will pick it apart. Immediately prior to the passage I'll quote, Vasconcelos weaves a pseudo-history of Atlantis and Lemuria into his narrative, which I find absurd, but he has a purpose for doing this. Quote, the confirmation of the great antiquity of our continent may seem idle to those who see nothing in the chain of events but a fateful repetition of meaningless patterns. With boredom, we should regard the work of the contemporary civilization if the Toltec palaces would tell us nothing else but that civilizations pass away, leaving no other fruit than a few carved stones piled upon each other or forming arched vaults or roofs of two planes intersecting at an angle. Why begin again if within 4 or 5 thousand years other new immigrants will distract their leisure by pondering upon the ruins of our trivial contemporary architecture? Scientific history becomes confused and leaves unanswered all these ruminations. Empirical history, suffering from myopia, loses itself in details, but it cannot determine a single antecedent from historical times. It flees from general conclusions, from transcendental hypotheses, to fall into the puerility of the description of utensils and cranial indices, and so many other merely external minutiae that lack importance when seen from a vast and comprehensive theory." Unquote. In his poetic rejection of scientific history and empirical history, we see the rejection of positivism, and this is significant. It constitutes a reaction against the earlier influence of positivism, since positivism had a significant career in Latin America. Auguste Comte, who was the founder of positivism and whom I discussed in my episode Demography is Destiny, proposed a religion of humanity, which eventually was founded and became popular in Brazil, and there is still today a positivist church of Brazil. And the slogan, "Order and Progress," which is on the Brazilian flag, came from Comte. This success of positivism in Latin America resulted in a backlash in the form of figures like Vasconcelos and, for example, José Enrique Rodó in Uruguay. Also in this passage, we see a very different valuation of the perennial idea of the rise and fall of civilizations as that which constitutes history. In several posts, I've discussed Hugh Trevor Roper's conception of history as being constituted by purposive movement, which purposive movement sets civilizations apart from non-civilized and pre-civilized society. Vasconcelos calls this purposive movements of civilization a fateful repetition of meaningless patterns, though he implicitly attributes this view to others. If we equate historical purpose with historical pattern, and I'm not suggesting that this is universally valid or even desirable, then the purposive movement of history is no more meaningful than the ebb and flow history of non-civilized and pre-civilized societies. According to this way of understanding history, civilization is simply ebb and flow history of a higher order of magnitude and complexity, but not qualitatively different from it. However, merely to make this latter observation suggests the possibility that when ebb and flow history, or what Vasconcelos calls a repetition of meaningless patterns, passes a certain threshold, qualitatively distinct properties appear, marking off a distinctive new period in history, perhaps marking off a distinctive new civilization. Vasconcelos' explicit rejection of what he calls scientific history and empirical history begs a question. If the method of the historian or the philosopher of history is not to be scientific or empirical, what then ought it to be? We saw in my recent episode on Henry Frankfurt the example of a 20th century archaeologist who explicitly rejected scientific historiography, though Frankfurt never offered a viable alternative. As I pointed out then, Wilhelm Windelband's conception of history as an ideographic science offers an alternative to the idea of scientific history having to follow the model of, say, physics or chemistry, and this may be a viable alternative to what both Frankfurt and Vasconcelos condemn as scientific history. Archaeologists since Frankfurt's time have mostly assimilated to a vaguely scientific view of history while avoiding as many as possible of any theoretic commitments that might box them in. Vasconcelos doesn't explicitly formulate an alternative to scientific history, but he hints at one when he says that scientific history flees from general conclusions and transcendental hypotheses. Presumably, then, the history that Vasconcelos would favor would consist of transcendental hypotheses. So what does he mean by that? Michael and Dina Weinstein, in their paper, The Problematic of Marginality in Mexican Philosophy, attributes to one of the translators of Husserl's Logical Investigations into Spanish, José Gauss, the following interpretation of Vasconcelos' method. Quote, Vasconcelos, independently of European realists, developed and elaborated the thesis that all purely eidetic knowledge fails to capture reality, which is composed of singular and individual entities, unquote. Since Gauss is coming from a phenomenological perspective, he no doubt formulated this in terms of eidetic knowledge. But for all practical purposes, this is the now familiar distinction between the nomothetic and the ideographic, with Gauss attributing to Vasconcelos the ultimate inadequacy of essential knowledge, that is to say, eidetic knowledge, or what Gauss calls eidetic knowledge, following Husserl. From this, one might conclude that one ought to focus on the singular and the individual details of history. But this doesn't seem to be the case at all with Vasconcelos. In the above quoted passage by Vasconcelos, he says something that I haven't encountered in any other philosophy of history, which points in the opposite direction of a focus on singular and individual details. Vasconcelos says that empirical history, suffering from myopia, loses itself in details. This is an interesting and unusual observation. Like I said, I haven't seen this in any philosopher of history. And I have myself noticed that where genuine understanding is lacking, scholars will take a refuge in recounting precise details. And this approach has the advantage that it can be continued thoughtlessly for as long as need be. So you can keep on storing up this precise knowledge even if you don't have any understanding, and wait for hopefully understanding to come through at some point in time. Vasconcelos calls this the description of utensiles and cranial indices. While I can't follow Vasconcelos in his implied condemnation of scientific and empirical history, nor his pseudo-history of Atlantis and Lemuria, I can understand and appreciate the criticisms that he makes. My takeaway from the valid scope of this criticism is that historians and philosophers of history need to spend more time developing the conceptual framework they employ, no less than their empirical investigations. Either one without the other is a vain and empty undertaking, and while the conceptual framework we formulate for understanding history may not be a vast and comprehensive theory, such as Vasconcelos has suggested is desirable, it probably needs to be more robust and daring than the implicit contemporary ideal of scientific history shorn of all philosophical content and commitment. The humanistic and therefore non-positivist retort to Vasconcelos, obviously there would be a positivist retort to Vasconcelos because he's explicitly dissing the positivist, you could say, but the non-positivist retort of the Vasconcelos' desire to see history understood in terms of transcendental hypotheses, as he called them, is to be found in Michel de Montaigne, who had seen transcendental hypotheses in action and felt that they followed from the lowest instincts of human nature rather than from the most elevated. Montaigne wrote, quote, "They would put themselves out of themselves and escape from being men. It is folly. Instead of transforming themselves into angels, they transform themselves into beasts. Instead of elevating, they lay themselves lower. These transcendental humors affright me, like high and inaccessible places, and nothing is hard for me to digest in the life of Socrates but his ecstasies and communications with demons. Nothing so human in Plato as that for which they say he was called divine, and of our sciences, those seem to be the most terrestrial and low that are highest and mounted. And I find nothing so humble and mortal in the life of Alexander as his fancies about his immortalization," unquote. Years ago, when I only occasionally made spoken word productions, I made one about this quote from Montaigne because I find it so fascinating. So I will... I suggest listening to that, though it probably hasn't come up to my current standards. In any case, the transcendental humors that worried Montaigne and the transcendental hypotheses that attracted Vasconcelos are, like technologies, we could say, dual use. They can be used for good and ill. We need our transcendental humors and our transcendental hypotheses, and here we can agree with Vasconcelos. We also need to regulate our transcendental humors and hypotheses, and here we can agree with Montaigne. So happy birthday, José Vasconcelos, and thanks for listening.